Welcome into the Sportsmemo NFL Every Game on the Board podcast, Wildcard Weekend Edition. The NFL playoffs are here with our guest, Robbie Vino. Rob, happy Friday to you. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Happy Friday to you, Drew. Nice to be here again for the Friday pod. Not in every game. Well, I guess it isn't every game on the board, right? The wild card 4 games. We're going to do them all. So glad to be here. Excited for this weekend for sure.
Yeah, we'll get Robbie Vino's 4 opinions on the NFL playoffs and quick thoughts on the national championship game and maybe some FCS championship game thoughts as well if we have enough time. But we got 102 to kick us off. Indianapolis at Houston, 48 the total, Robbie. Looks like Houston down to -1 favorites.
Yeah, there's been certainly a lot of support for the Indianapolis Colts throughout the 5 days here since the game opened. And probably rightfully so, Drew, when you go through all the numbers. But then again, you have a divisional matchup where teams have played twice already. They've split those games, this being the so-called rubber match. We'll see how this one goes. Both of the first two, obviously 3-point decisions. Both road teams win each game. Indy wins in Houston 24-21 most recently, and of course Houston wins way back when they were, I think, 0-3. They win the overtime game 37-34. Most recent matchup, Indianapolis held a pretty good total yardage advantage, 436 to 315, and for the Indianapolis Colts, it's been pretty good on both sides of the ball, Drew. They're a hot team anyway, but if you just go through their total yardage numbers, they have outgained 13 of their last 14 opponents heading into this contest, so that's a pretty strong number. Some things to consider here as far as the two matchups during the regular season between these teams are concerned. Quarterbacks getting sacked here, quite a difference. Andrew Luck dropped back in 2 games to pass the ball against the Texans 103 times. In those 103 pass attempts, he was only sacked 6 times. Indianapolis has protected him well all season long. That's an average of 1 sack every 17.2 pass attempts. That's with Jadeveon Clowney. That's with J.J. Watt. That's with Whitney Merciless. The whole gang there at Houston just could not get through that Indianapolis offensive line. So the Texans, most noted for their pass rush, has had difficult with this team. It hasn't been the same on the other side. Deshaun Watson has dropped back 80 times against the Colts so far this season, been sacked 12 times in 80 attempts. That's once every 6.7. It's about an 11 attempt difference there, Drew. That's significant in this case. So unless Houston finds a way to fix their offensive line problems that have shown up glaringly against these Colts, it could be troublesome. For Indianapolis, they've played 2 3-point games against the Texans this year without running the football whatsoever. In 2 contests, they gained 914 total yards, 457 per. Big number. But of the 914, 823 came through the air. 90% of the Colts' total yardage against the Texans this season has come through the air. So the Texans' secondary also has an issue here to correct. I think if you're Indianapolis, boy, I don't know how it changes, Drew. The most recent contest between these two teams, Andrew Luck threw the ball even more than he did the first time. He threw it 52 times. So I think Indianapolis has found something there where they can move the football through the air. T.Y. Hilton looks to be healthy. For the Texans, Deshaun Watson's had some success through the air as well, completing 70% of his passes against the Colts. Total sits at 48. For good reason. The numbers I'm throwing out there right now off of the first 2 meetings indicate that perhaps the running games will be quieted a little bit as they were the first 2 times, and the passing game will take over. Could see a stride for stride type contest between Andrew Luck and Deshaun Watson. But I think for Deshaun Watson, it's real important that he gets wide receiver Kiki Qt back for this game. It looks like he's going to go, Drew, but he has been listed as questionable the last couple of weeks and hasn't been able to go. So hopefully he goes here for Houston because they need that extra receiver to help Deshaun Watson out. Neither of these teams has played a difficult schedule this season, only 3 playoff teams each. I think what may end up being the difference in this one is the fact that in the playoffs, you would much rather score touchdowns than kick field goals. Red zone numbers weigh heavily in favor of the Indianapolis Colts here. The Colts are number 5 in red zone offense, touchdown scoring only, not field goals added in, just touchdowns inside the opponent's 20-yard line. The Colts are number 5 in the NFL. They scored in red zone touchdown percentage. And the defense is number 11 in preventing touchdowns when other teams get into the red zone. Add to that the fact that the Texans rank near the bottom in both of those categories. They're 28th in red zone touchdowns scored. They're 29th in red zone touchdowns allowed. That could be your difference in what seems to be really a game where you could be splitting hairs. Obviously, the 1-point spread indicates that.
Yeah, I like that stat you just pointed out. Also, these are two of the hottest teams in the NFL. Indianapolis started off 1-5. Houston started 0-3. So down the stretch, both of these two teams have been really good. Particularly Indianapolis won 9 of 10 to end the regular season. I'll tell you, Robbie, one reason I like the Indianapolis Colts, Deshaun Watson for the Houston side has been hit more than any other quarterback in the NFL. Opposing that is the Indianapolis offensive line, which I think is one of the best units in the NFL. So Andrew Luck behind there makes me point towards Indianapolis. Robbie, we got another game here, but first want to throw out the coupon code PLAYOFF to all the listeners to take $100 off the rest of the NFL season. We just discounted it to just $199, and that includes the Super Bowl prop package from Robbie Vino, Teddy Covers, myself, any Sportsmemo handicapper on the website. You can take an extra $100 off of that using the coupon code PLAYOFF. That brings it down to just $99 to get Robbie Vino's rest of NFL season. That's the full playoffs plus the Super Bowl prop package there for just $99 using the coupon code PLAYOFF at checkout. We got Seattle at Dallas up next, Robbie. 43 the total, with Dallas laying 2 at home.
Yeah, interesting game here. Obviously another matchup where there was a previous meeting during the regular season, so we can refer back to that, although this one was played way back in late September. The Seahawks at home win that game 24-13. Final score somewhat deceiving because statistically, if you just looked at it, you would think that Dallas would be closer than 11 points in that contest. Dallas runs the football 19 times for 166 yards. That's 8.7 per carry. You don't see too many teams, Drew, lose games by double digits when they rush for 8.7 per, but that's exactly what happened to the Dallas Cowboys in that game. And it's really predicated upon the fact that Dak Prescott got sacked 5 times in that game, and they turned it over 3 times, and Seattle was a clean 0 turnovers. So +3 turnover margin, always going to be good. That kind of leads you to Seattle's entire season, where they ranked number 1 in the NFL in turnover differential. +15, huge number for the Seahawks. Could end up being a difference in this game. We'll see if Prescott can protect the ball and if the offensive line can protect him. Ezekiel Elliott, off a week of rest, should be very good to go here. Both of these teams obviously are anchored offensively in their running game. Chris Carson has been tremendous for the Seahawks. I think they average 160 rushing yards per game, which is unheard of in NFL nowadays. Some of that obviously attributed to Russell Wilson's ability to run the football, but 2 really good running games. 2 teams that have weapons that can be used, although the downfield throw is not necessarily used a bunch by either side. I think in this game that Dak Prescott and the Cowboys will use Amari Cooper downfield more than we've seen in the past, and I do think that Seattle will also look for their guy Tyler Lockett downfield. It's interesting, Drew, a quick number here as far as total is concerned. If you play totals and you're like me, you have been on board with the Seattle Seahawks over the number quite a bit this season. Their last 8 games heading into this contest, Seattle is 7-1 over the total. Those 8 games, they've averaged almost 54 points per contest, 53.9 to be exact. No game total has gone less than 42 points. It was a little more relevant a couple of days ago when the total was 42. Now we're up to 43. But certainly the over has been a huge part of Seattle's betting trends this year. In fact, the correlating parlay between Seattle and over has worked quite a bit. Seattle's 10-3-1 against the spread in their last 14 games. Let's not sell the Cowboys short. They're red hot against the number entering this one as well. They're 6-1-1 against the spread their last 8 games heading into this, and at home they've been really good, 7-1 straight up, which is really all you're asking them to win by in this game. I mean, the number is low enough to where only a 1-point victory would hurt you, but at -2, if you can find a 1.5, Dallas 7-1 straight up at home, pretty strong number as well. So good game between these two, rematch. I think both teams are vulnerable in certain areas. I do think that they've probably heard enough of outside noise as to how they just can't get the ball downfield. Seattle's done it quite a bit this season. I think Dak Prescott taking a lot of heat at this point in time. We'll see if he can come in and play well in this game.
Robbie, looking at this game, this is another game I kind of like. Usually I only release one play a week in the NFL, which I did to the clients, but 2 others I bet. This is one I just think both teams similar stylistically. Seattle led the NFL in total rushing yards and rushing attempts, and on the other side, offensively, Ezekiel Elliott led all players in rushing yards and attempts. So the team in total rushing yards and then the player in total rushing yards leading the NFL going up against each other. I think both of these two teams keep the ball on the ground, grind the clock, and like you just brought up, Seattle in the over trends. I'm going to try to buck that and bet it under. Do you agree with me, or you kind of like the over here, Robbie?
Yeah, I've always, Drew, and we've done a lot of podcasts together this season, and I've always basically used my gauge for the Seattle Seahawks as when Doug Baldwin is on the field. To me, Doug Baldwin is one of those rare players in the NFL, and not necessarily a household name by any means, as a number 1 wide receiver in the NFL that makes a huge difference in Seattle's offensive production. When he's healthy and out there, I've tended to bet them over. Despite the fact that they're a run-heavy team, they do get over the number quite a bit. I just mentioned they're 7-1 over their last 8 games heading into this one. Baldwin, a ton of targets the last 2 weeks. Shows me he's healthy here. It helps Tyler Lockett. It helps the ground game. That offensive line has been good. So they're kind of dueling statistics, right? I mean, if you take what you're saying about wanting to play the under because both teams love to run the football, which is absolutely factual, and then you take the fact that Seattle, a team that averages 160 on the ground but plays overs, and not just regular overs, they're averaging 54 points per game in these overs, and those two are kind of conflicting against one another. I've had success playing Seattle over. Looks like the money early here has played toward the over. It's up from 41 to 43, but I don't know how much room is left in that number, Drew. 44 is a very key number in football. 24-20, 27-17. There's a lot of ways to land on 44. So if you like over, I think you probably need to get it now at 43. You give yourself a much higher percentage chance. If you like under, maybe you sit and wait for 44 and see if that happens.
Guys, coupon code PLAYOFF, PLAYOFF at checkout gives you Robbie Vino's rest of NFL season for under $100. That coupon code is PLAYOFF at sportsmemo.com. Robbie, on to the Sunday games here. LA Chargers at the Baltimore Ravens. Total of 41.5 or 42. Looks like the Ravens laying 2.5 or 3. So an important game to shop around depending on which side you like. The key number there hovering around 3. Robbie, we just talked about two teams similar stylistically. I think both of these two teams are pretty different stylistically. Chargers having to go across the country. How would you look to bet here, Chargers-Ravens, Robbie?
Yeah, well, certainly if you were just going to use against the spread numbers from this season as your only handicapping tool whatsoever, you would probably run to the window and play the Chargers plus points, because on the road this year they're 7-1 against the spread. It's as strong a number as you're going to get, and the opposition list hasn't necessarily been weak. I mean, they went to Kansas City and won the game outright. They went to Pittsburgh, won that game outright. Obviously, they have to play divisional games that are always tough. Even though it is Denver and Oakland, they're always tough. So they've had a pretty difficult road schedule, and they've come up roses 7-1 so far this season. One game that we can note where they had to come to the Eastern time zone, Drew, is a game on October 14th where they played the Cleveland Browns, an Eastern time zone team. LA wins that one 38-14 going away. So they seem to be unaffected by it this year, the cross-country travel. And I don't know that they'll be affected by it in a playoff scenario. It's a big game for Phillip Rivers, who's nearing the end of his career. Just from a exterior standpoint, here's a guy that he's always focused, but maybe even more focused to get a playoff win here. I think we have a meeting to go on here that was just played a couple of weeks ago where Baltimore goes to L.A. and really beats Los Angeles soundly in a game where L.A. was favored. I mean, L.A. is a 4-point favorite in that contest. They only scored 10 points. They only gain 198 yards. I think when you're handicapping this one, Drew, the question you have to ask yourself is, are those numbers real? Is Baltimore that good defensively that they could totally stymie what is one of the best offenses in the NFL? Or is that game more of a mirage? For myself, I treat it as more of a mirage because there just hasn't been anything close to that performance from the Chargers all season long. Now, they sputtered a little bit last week against Denver to a 23-9 victory. And, we like to believe that maybe these teams don't scoreboard watch. And you hate to sit there and, you could justify any selection that you make. And I don't think I want to make a total justification for a 23-9 win against Denver based on scoreboard watching. But the fact of the matter is, LA enters that 4:25 start Eastern time last week, and with an opportunity to become the number one seed in the AFC. They have to win. They need Kansas City to lose. Within a minute and a half, Kansas City's up 7-0. Within 3 minutes, they're up 14-0. And I think by halftime, LA knew they were going to be the number 5 seed. They played hard second half, opened up the lead, win 23-9. This team, to me, has far more offensive balance than do the Baltimore Ravens. Melvin Gordon back to full health now. The running game for LA has been great this year. The receiving core, when you're talking about the top two being Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, is outstanding. Tight end play is good. Antonio Gates has made a pretty good comeback this year. Hunter Henry may play in this game, their top tight end option, although he'll be on a snap count. I just think there's more ways for LA to move the football here. Baltimore's got ways too. They've got productive players. They've got guys that can get downfield. You almost forget that they have Michael Crabtree. You almost forget that they have the speedy John Brown at wide receiver because they've chosen to play call so heavily toward the run now. I think, once again, Drew, I'm probably not a firm believer yet that Lamar Jackson can win a game for his team when forced to be consistent throwing the football. If I'm LA, I try to force him to do that. Let's load the box. Let's take the run away. Let's see what they can do through the air. Just not sure that they're as capable as LA is. LA's got so many facets in the passing game as far as backs out of the backfield, intermediate, deep. They've got all the throws. And I'll say this. For all the stuff we've heard about Baltimore statistically ranking number one in the AFC in defense, 2 of the last 4 weeks, they've given up over 400 yards total offense. They gave up 441 to Kansas City. No sin there, but they didn't play great defense against KC. And then last week in a must game, they give up 426 yards on 56 plays to the Cleveland Browns and Baker Mayfield. So there's some dents that can be made in the Baltimore defense. See if Phillip Rivers and company can find them.
Robbie, we got one more NFL game here, 41 being the total with Philadelphia at Chicago. The Chicago Bears laying 6.5 pretty much across the board, Robbie. It looks like Chicago might have a little bit of a weather issue on Sunday, seeing upwards of 20-mile-an-hour winds, 35 degrees. But I think the question here is, Chicago's defense, one of the better units. Philadelphia's defensive side, which one are we going to get? The one that's been susceptible at times, or the one that shut out Washington to end the regular season, Robbie? How would you look to bet Philadelphia at Chicago?
Yeah, the one thing that still stands true with Philadelphia, although the defense has gotten healthier over the course of the last 7 weeks, I think they got Jordan Hicks back at linebacker last week for 21 plays in that game against Washington. But the one place where they're still vulnerable is in the secondary. Avonte Maddox, Rasul Douglas especially, Drew, on a corner is susceptible to deep pass. He's susceptible to speed from an opposing wide receiver. You try and get him matched up against speed. He's a far better tackler than he is coverage guy. And that secondary is prone to penalty flags. So I think if you're Chicago, if you have opportunities with Taylor Gabriel, one of the fastest guys in the NFL, you try to take the top off a little bit. Chicago's got speed to get downfield for sure. If you sit here and look at the personnel, especially on offense, there's a ton of similarities. So we won't go through them. We'll just leave it at that. There's a ton of similarities. Backs out of the backfield, tight ends that can produce, big wide receivers that are good on 50-50 balls, a whole lot of things that are the same for both of these teams. Let's try and see what's different about these two squads. And for me, there's a couple of differences here. One will be the running game, another will be pass protection, and another will be takeaways, and I think all three of those favor the Bears. For the Bears, real quick, a addition to the offense that's been been talked about very, very little this week is the fact that Kyle Long, their all-pro right guard, came back last week, missed 8 games, came back last week, got in 27 snaps, looked pretty good. No coincidence that on the game he comes back, their top running back, Jordan Howard, has his best rushing game of the year. Goes for 109 yards on 21 carries, 5.2 a pop, a couple of TDs. One was a 42-yarder. But if you dig even deeper, Drew, I'll give you this. Kyle Long has played in 8 games this year for the Bears. He hasn't played in 8 games this year for the Bears. In the 8 games that he didn't play, the Bears' rush offense gained 806 yards, and that's only 100 per game. In the 8 games that he has played, including last week, they run for 1,132 yards. It's 141.5 per game. That's a 41.5 yard increase in their rushing offense when Kyle Long is present on that offensive line. 7 of those 8 games where he was involved, they ran for between 122 and 179. That's huge against a Philadelphia run defense that probably is the strength of this team. They haven't been phenomenal this year. Their overall statistical number will show you that they've been well above average. But if you break them down, you're going to find some numbers that could be a little bit alarming. Prior to their final 3 games of the season, they had a stretch of 8 where in 7 of those 8 games, they allowed 100 yards or more rushing the football, and 6 of them were for 121 or more. So right away, that's un-Eagle-like. And even in the final 3, where they settled down and kept teams under 100 yards, I think you can discard the Washington game last week. The depleted offensive line was no match for Philly, for anybody who watched that game. I think you can discard the game 3 weeks ago against the Rams. Even though the Rams have Todd Gurley, they only ran the ball 18 times because they were forced to abandon the run game. They were coming from behind. Even in 18 carries, they gained 82 yards, which is almost 5 a pop, 4.5, closer to 4.5 a pop. The middle game against Houston with a running quarterback in Deshaun Watson probably is the one you could hang your hat on. But I don't know that Philly's run defense is as good as the Bears, and the fact that Long increases the Bears' rushing ability, I think that's a big, big difference here. The Bears are 7-1 against the spread at home this year, winning games by 10.5 points per contest. They've been fantastic as a home favorite, 6-0 against the spread. They lead the league in takeaways, 36 takeaways, 27 interceptions, which is 6 more than any other team in the league. And those 3 things to me, pass protection, run offense, takeaways, are big enough advantages to start looking at the Bears. 6.5 is a big number. I don't think you want it to climb to 7. If you like 6.5, I would get it now. Don't let it climb any higher than that 6.5. One last thing we'll say here is we didn't talk a lot in this podcast, Drew, about teams' strength of schedule faced this season. And there's a good reason for it. Not a lot of these teams have faced really good schedules. In fact, the only team in this wild card round that I could find that played a decent schedule, strength of schedule wise, was the Eagles. They played 6 playoff teams, head and shoulders more than anybody else involved in this weekend's play. The reason being, the 20 teams that didn't make the playoffs, 17 of them had losing records. There's only 3 teams that did not make the playoffs that had winning records. Shows you how weak and what a disparity there was between teams in the NFL this year. 15 with winning records and 17 with losing records. Therefore, you couldn't have played a lot of playoff teams here. So I don't know that we factor the Philly schedule in much. I think Chicago at home might be the right way to go.
All right, Robbie, good breakdown of the NFL there, guys. And coupon code PLAYOFF at checkout gives you $100 off. His rest of the NFL playoff package includes the Super Bowl prop report as well. That's PLAYOFF at checkout for Robbie Vino's or any Sports Memos NFL rest of the season. Robbie, before we end the podcast here, did you want to throw out any thoughts on the national championship game, Alabama, Clemson, or the FCS championship game?
Yeah, I will say this, Drew. I have not had, in all the time that I've done power ratings, have never had a team rated as high as Alabama. I've never had a championship game opponent rated as high as Clemson. I mean, the line is in a pretty good spot. I even had it lower. Power ratings showed this one to be Alabama 3.5 on a neutral. Great game. We won't get into a full breakdown of it, but I would expect that Alabama may be able to take better advantage of Clemson's secondary than Notre Dame was. Tua, obviously a very accurate quarterback, but then again, Trevor Lawrence accurate as well. In the FCS game, you see North Dakota State attracting a lot of money here. At this point in time, they've gone from 13.5-point favorites all the way to 16-point favorites in a lot of spots. Justified. The game is played at a neutral site, though, in Frisco, Texas. This isn't played in the Fargo Dome. All the other FCS playoff games are played at home sites. This one gets a neutral. Eastern Washington, very explosive offense up there. I don't think they have enough to beat North Dakota State. North Dakota State's been phenomenal this year. Probably agree with the line movement. Total there sits at 60.5, 61. North Dakota State's defense usually very, very fierce. We'll see if it can get up that high.
All right, Robbie, great podcast. Best of luck with your bets this weekend. And guys out there, best of luck with your bets. We'll be right back with Brent Crow's College Basketball Saturday edition.